Alright, so in round 6 of the World Open, I was paired against FIDE Master Tansel Turgut, and I had just come off of a pretty tough loss the previous round, so this was the following morning, so I was hoping to get back into the tournament with a win. I decided to play knight f3 again. I felt like this kind of worked out for me well in the last game, so I wanted to keep using it. Black played d5, I played e3, knight f6, c4, e6 and b3. So this is a position I've seen a couple times in recent tournaments where, as I've explained in previous videos, I feel like white gets a pretty flexible setup. You can develop your pieces in a number of different ways, and black also has a number of comfortable setups to choose from, but I feel that these positions are relatively less explored compared to some of the main lines that we see nowadays. So I just feel like I have better chances of outplaying my opponent in some kind of flexible position like this. Okay, in this position, my opponent chose to move b6. This is actually what Grandmaster Georgiev played against me in the Minnesota tournament, so I was still pretty familiar with some of the ideas in this line. I played bishop b2, bishop b7, knight c3, knight bd7. Now I decided to take on d5. Black plays e takes d5, which is just pretty standard here, and d4. So now I'm kind of taking some control over the center. At a certain point, black is often playing c5 in these positions, though not always, and we'll get a pretty tense battle in the center of the board. In the game, he played a6, which I think is a very reasonable move, just covering the b5 square. And like in the game against Georgiev, I decided to play bishop d3 here. It was after this game that I actually analyzed things a bit more carefully, and I realized that the move g3 is probably a better way for white to fight for an advantage in this position. I feel like after bishop d3, white doesn't really get enough. But this is actually quite interesting, just putting the bishop on g2, where I think it's going to be well placed in the structure. Then white can castle, play rook c1, and I think we have a really fluid and healthy position. And of course, black is still objectively solid and has to be okay here, but I think white has some interesting play here and can at least pose some problems. But okay, I play bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, rook c1. I think this is the main move. Here black has a lot of moves. They can play c5, which I think leads to a pretty interesting type of position. At a certain point, white might take and leave black with hanging pawns. And actually, like I mentioned in a previous video, I would really prefer to play against these pawns. So I would definitely feel comfortable here. I think knight e4 is also a very reasonable move, just planting the knight on e4 and trying to build up around it with queen e7 and rook fe8. And of course the move my opponent makes, rook e8, is also I think perfectly reasonable. And here I decided to play the move rook to c2. This was an idea I learned just by looking at the last game and looking at some of the games that have reached this position at the highest levels. And this is an idea that I noticed a couple of GMs used with the point of putting the queen either on c1 or in some cases on a1. And I think it's a nice little way of, let's say, putting a little bit more pressure on black's position here. The queen on c1 is nice because it's kind of putting a little bit more pressure along the c-file, and eventually this knight will move to e2, and white kind of gets this battery going on the c-file that I think is pretty effective. So I think it's a reasonable idea. Black played knight e4, which is definitely a useful move. I decided to play knight e2, and now black played the move rook to c8. I thought this was maybe not necessary, and I was expecting something like queen e7, which to me looked like the most natural move. I would probably play queen c1, and now maybe rook c8, knight f4, and the position is about equal. I think things are about balanced here. Black has a really strong knight on e4, but the bishop on b7 is not such a great piece. My bishop on b2 is also not that good. I'm hoping for an opportunity to play knight e5, although that might be difficult to achieve. But you know, the position is full of pieces and a lot of stuff can still happen here, so it would be, I think, a very tense middle game. But objectively, I think both sides are fine. Instead, my opponent played rook c8, which I felt like actually gave me some concrete options here that I started getting somewhat excited about. And eventually I landed on this move knight e5, which has been a move that I've been wanting to play for a while, but of course for the most part it's just been hanging a pawn, so it wasn't possible. The main point behind this move is that if black takes on e5 and let's say DE, bishop takes e5. My idea was to take on e4 here, and if black were to just recapture, then after the trade on e5, white would be able to win back the pawn with queen takes d8 and rook takes c7 in the end. And some endgame like this I think is really fantastic for white. Just big advantage. Black's bishop is really bad. White's knight is going to be very strong on d4. And had black actually in this position after bishop takes e5, thrown in queen takes d1 first, rook takes e1, and then rook takes e5. Well, rook d7 is very, very good for white, but even better is rook takes c7, and because of the back rank, white is just completely winning here. So that was kind of the main idea behind this move, knight e5. So again, I was just trying to justify it tactically. But of course, black has other options as well. He's not forced to take on e5. It's interesting, the other key line that I think both players had to calculate was after knight takes e5, DE, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e4, was that in this position, rather than just recapturing on e4, black could also play bishop takes b2. And at first glance, actually, this looks totally fine for black because black is currently up a pawn and both bishops are hanging. But white has the move bishop f5, and this seems to kind of kill all the fun because now black's bishop is still under attack and the rook is also under attack. So it seems like black is going to be losing in exchange. So I'm pretty sure my opponent probably calculated to this position and decided against the line because he didn't want to give up an exchange. I also felt like in this position, white should be better. I didn't think it would be totally winning, but an extra exchange is usually pretty good as long as you don't have huge weaknesses. But the engine actually doesn't mind. It just brings the bishop back. Bishop takes c8, queen takes c8. And according to Stockfish, white has no advantage in this position whatsoever. Black is at least equal. And actually looking at it now, it definitely makes sense. In general, it's considered that the two bishops and a pawn are often worth enough material for a rook and knight. So you don't need the usual two pawns as we commonly think. And in this case, yeah, black's two bishops are really well coordinated. They're both doing a great job, both protecting a lot of black's pawns, but also keeping an eye on the king side, meaning that black has a lot of potential counterplay here. And yeah, objectively, I think this position would be very tricky to handle for white, and probably it's a matter of opinion whether one would prefer white in this position or black. I think a lot of players would rather be white here with the material. A lot of players would rather be black with the dynamic compensation. Okay, so that was objectively playable for black, but we can understand why someone would not want to give up the exchange if they don't have to. I think objectively maybe the safest move was something like queen e7, where white has a nice choice here. I could either play knight c6 and try to establish this knight here or force black to give up the light squared bishop, or I could play f3 and achieve one of my main ideas in the position, which is just kicking the knight off of the e4 square, which would be a kind of a small win for white. Instead, black played the move c5, which I think looks really natural, but is probably just a concrete mistake. Because now I'm able to take on e4, go for this exchange, d takes c4, and after knight takes d7, queen takes d7, I can even take on c5, and because of the pin along the d file, black isn't able to keep his structure secure, so he is eventually going to have to take with the pawn. If he takes with the rook, then white can trade rooks, and then after b takes c5, black is going to get this pretty weakened structure where white has given up the bishop pair but has a lot of compensation in terms of black's pawns just all being very, very weak, and white's bishop on b2 being a really good piece. So I think white would have maybe a small edge here. It's also worth considering after rook takes c5 just to play the move rook d2. This is more of a concrete idea, just setting up this pin along the d file, forcing maybe rook c6, and then white can build up a lot of pressure with bishop a3. So that just might be very unpleasant for black. I'm not totally sure. It looked good during the game. My opponent actually just played b takes c5, so I didn't really have to make that decision. But yeah, I think bc5 is just a more solid move overall. So objectively, white doesn't have a huge advantage here, but it is a small edge, and if white isn't accurate, then black, I think, can equalize pretty comfortably in this position, because with the two bishops, black definitely has a lot of potential. Going back a few moves, the engine pointed out this resource after bishop takes e4, d takes e4, to, instead of taking on d7, which to me looked like the only move, to actually start with this move rook to d2, which is a very strong move that I just did not even consider, but I'll try to keep in the back of my mind for next time, because I feel like this could be a thematic idea. So the main point is to, again, line the rook up along the d-file and just threaten a lot of attacking moves here. Black can't really take on e5, because after d takes e5, I think the pin on the d-file is just too annoying, and white is just going to have a ton of pressure here. If black takes on d4, then white has a really fantastic shot, knight takes f7. Kind of temporarily sacrificing a piece, because after king takes f7, rook takes d4, white is going to be winning a piece back. So we're not going to be down a piece for very long. In fact, white is soon just going to be up at least a pawn. So yeah, that was a really, really nice tactic. I think after rook d2, black's best move is the move c4. Which, well, basically just gives up a pawn, but at least keeps the position under control. And then after b takes c4, I think white just has a pretty clear advantage. The engine doesn't think it's such a huge advantage, because it feels like black might have some compensation here for the extra pawn, but to a human point of view, it really just doesn't feel like black has enough, and white should be doing really well here. So yeah, this move rook d2 was really crushing. I mean, this was the only way to fully punish black for c5, which I think is basically the reason why this move is a mistake. But yeah, I'll just have to keep it in mind for next time. So I took it on d7. I took on d7. I took on c5. B takes c5, and I decided to start with knight g3 here. Rook d2 was probably a better choice, and I think I should have started with this one, just forcing black to defend the bishop with something like rook d8, and then after knight g3 we would get something that's really similar to the game. But I started with this move, knight g3. Black played rook d8 anyway, although probably he should have just tried to unpin with queen e6 first, and now after rook d2 he doesn't have to play rook d8, he can just move his bishop out of the way, and I think this would actually be much closer to equal for black. But okay, he played rook c d8. And yeah, my main idea here was to play rook to d2. This move comes with a threat of bishop takes g7, with the idea being after king takes g7, we have rook takes d6, and then if queen takes d6, the knight will come to f5 with check. So black, I think, has to play the move f6 here to kind of prevent this threat, and this looks like a small achievement. We've kind of induced a small weakness, but during the game, I don't know, I wasn't sure if it's enough. But yeah, I think this was actually just the most that white could get. Something like queen c2 is a good follow-up. Let's say black tries queen e6, rook d1. And the problem here, I think what I didn't really fully appreciate is that it's still hard for black to unpin here, because the bishop is kind of tied down to the c5 pawn. So a move like bishop e7 is just not working after rook d8, rook takes d8, and queen takes c5. Or white can play bishop a3 first, but in any case, white is just taking a pawn and is going to be a pawn up for a while. Whether the position can be won against black's two bishops is definitely hard to say, but okay, it's clear that white is the one that's playing for two results there. And so if black can't unpin easily with bishop e7, then it's really kind of a difficult situation, because I'm wanting to play bishop a3 soon. Black can't really move the rook off of the d-file until the bishop is defended. So yeah, it's actually, I think, slightly worse for black, maybe even much worse if he doesn't find a good move soon. In any case, I instead decided to play queen h5. To me, I just didn't feel like rook d2 was really getting enough, and in fact I decided to keep my rook on the c-file, specifically so that I could just focus on targeting the c5 pawn right away. I convinced myself that this was just kind of the most effective, or let's say most ambitious approach to the position, just kind of hammering down on black's weakness. But my opponent defended this one well, and he's able to create enough counterplay that I'm just not able to win the pawn in time. He started with bishop f8. I played rook fc1, queen e6, bishop a3. Now rook d5, I have to move my queen back, queen e2, and queen e5. So it looks a little awkward, but I mean the c5 pawn is protected, and my pieces aren't really able to add on a lot more pressure. Now it really feels like the knight on g3 is misplaced, since I'm kind of abandoning all ideas of playing on the king side. I kept trying here with bishop b2. Black played queen g5 and rook to d2. So my idea here was that, okay, he's currently defending quite well with his rook on the 5th rank, so I wanted to trade off one pair of rooks and then make it somewhat more difficult for him to defend the c5 pawn, because I'm still going to come back bishop a3. Maybe he'll have to put this rook on c8, and then maybe I'll have time to bring my knight in or put some pressure on the e4 pawn. Who knows? At this point, I kind of started feeling that I had already lost whatever advantage I had, and it was probably closer to equal if anything, but I still wanted to be able to try to at least put some slight pressure and see if I can maybe provoke some weakness or try to get some chances. So rook d8, I traded on d5, queen takes d5. Here I played h3. I also considered the move bishop a3, but after, for example, queen d2 or queen d3, I think is also okay. Black basically gets enough activity in the endgame. So takes. If I take on c5, for example, black can take, give rook d1 check, or play g6 first. I think rook d1 is probably simpler, and then g6 to avoid the back rank. And yeah, now white has to be very careful because this pressure along the first rank is really annoying. If my rook is not careful, then at some point black's bishop might get to b5, and that'll be really bad for my knight. And in the meantime, it's not even so easy to untangle, because if I play g3, king g2, eventually my king is going to have to deal with some kind of counterplay on the light squares at the bishop coming to g4 and f3. So I really felt like this would be super unclear, and yeah, the engine thinks black is totally fine there, easily has enough play for at least equality. So yeah, I made a practical decision just to create lift for my king. Now I don't have to deal with any back rank checks, but yeah, it is kind of an important tempo. Black played queen d2, trying to trade off the queens. I play rook c2 here, queen takes e2, knight takes e2, rook d1 check, king h2, and again, I don't think black is totally out of the woods yet, because I do have ideas of just returning with my bishop to a3, and if black is not careful and just lets white pick up a pawn, then he might not get enough compensation, and the rook and knight could be really good here. But he found the accurate move here, bishop c6. This really gives black enough counterplay in the position. Now after bishop a3, bishop b5. I'm not in time to take on c5 because of the move bishop d3, which is a very nice response. Now the rook has to stay in contact with the knight, otherwise black will just take, but the rook also has to stay in contact with the bishop. So rook b2 is just losing to bishop takes c5. So basically this is unplayable for white. I can't take on c5. Instead I have to go knight c3. At this point I basically realized it's time to kind of shut things down and make a draw, because I realize my advantage is really gone, and if I'm not careful I could end up worse. After all, black has two bishops, we're in an endgame, black has this active rook. If I'm not careful, I was thinking about some of my nightmares from Minnesota, where I started going wrong in some endgames. Then my opponent, could all of a sudden get some chances and start playing for the win. So I really wanted to make sure I play solid here and I don't give him any real chances. So I play knight c3. Now black is basically obliged to play bishop d3. If the rook moves somewhere, then I'm going to take on b5, and then I'll probably be ready to take on c5, and I think that'll just be winning a pawn for white. So bishop d3 was forced, knight takes d1, bishop takes c2, and yeah, now we just have this pure endgame with two bishops versus bishop and knight, which is actually the most dangerous in terms of my opponent having the two bishops. But I realized that because of the threat of knight a4, white should have enough play immediately against the c5 pawn that it's going to be really hard for black to do much here, and more likely than not, a lot of the pawns are going to get traded. It's very likely that all the queenside pawns will just get traded, and the position will soon peter out into a draw. That's kind of what happened. Black played bishop d6 check, I played king g1, he played bishop e5. I think this is actually just a clean way to force the draw, although at this point black is not really the one who has to be worried about being able to make a draw. The idea here is that if white goes knight a4, black will have the move c4, and the knight on a4 is hanging, and black is threatening to take on b3. So at this point black is definitely at least fine, maybe even doing really well if the pawn gets to c3 and is threatening to promote all of a sudden. Instead, after bishop e5, I played bishop b2. Now my next move might be knight a4 and try to trade off the dark squared bishops. So my opponent decided to just shut things down. Bishop takes c3. I recaptured, offered a draw, and that was it. Objectively, black definitely didn't have to take on c3. I don't think black is worse at all, and he could find a way to keep the two bishops here. Yeah, I don't think black had such realistic winning chances here. I think it's just a very, very tiny micro advantage. So I wasn't too surprised that my opponent just decided to just end the game solidly. So yeah, draw in this game, not the best result, but I felt like, you know, at least I played reasonably well out of the opening. I did find a position, or managed to get a position where white had some advantage. I missed some chances for a bigger advantage, of course, missing the move rook d2, not in one, but actually in two positions. Okay, in one position I didn't really miss it, I just kind of decided against it. Well, you're not going to win every game with white, and my opponent is a really solid player, so I didn't see this as too much of a loss. I just thought, okay, draw is a normal result, and I can still keep up a good tournament performance from here. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next videos.